Rita had always believed that her church was the best place to find a husband. She had seen couples in her congregation get married and live what seemed to be perfect lives. Her pastor always preached about godly marriages and how marrying a fellow believer would guarantee happiness. Rita took his words to heart. When she turned 28, she decided it was time to settle down. She prayed, fasted, and told her church elders about her desire. She was confident that once she married a man from her church, everything would be perfect. One Sunday after service, Brother Daniel approached her. He was a respected member of the church, always active in fellowships and known for his strong faith. Rita had seen him lead prayers and give testimonies about his spiritual journey. When he expressed interest in her, she saw it as an answer to her prayers. The church elders were pleased, and within months, their courtship began. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. However, there were small things that didn't sit well with Rita. Daniel was firm in his opinions, often shutting down conversations when she tried to express herself. He told her that as a wife, her role was to obey, not to argue. Rita brushed off her worries, believing that with time, he would change. After all, he was a man of God. The wedding planning was smooth, with the church handling most of the arrangements. The elders praised Rita for choosing a godly man, and her parents were proud of her decision. On the wedding day, the church was filled with people singing and celebrating. Rita felt like she was walking into a dream. She looked at Daniel, her husband, and believed she had made the right choice. As they exchanged vows, Rita promised to submit to Daniel, while he vowed to love and lead her. The pastor gave a long sermon on obedience and the role of a wife in marriage. Rita noticed how much emphasis was placed on her duties, but she smiled and nodded, believing everything would be fine. The reception was grand, and everyone admired the couple. "You are lucky, Rita," one of the church women whispered. "Daniel is a real man of God." Rita felt reassured. This was the beginning of her perfect life. The first few weeks of marriage were smooth, but Rita quickly realized that Daniel was different at home. He was strict about household rules, insisting that dinner must be ready at exactly 7 p.m. If she was late, he would get angry and refuse to eat. He also disliked when she questioned his decisions, saying that as the head of the home, his word was final. One evening, Rita asked if they could go out for dinner, but Daniel refused. "A godly wife doesn't waste money on restaurants," he said firmly. Rita felt disappointed, but decided to obey. She reminded herself that marriage required patience and sacrifice. As days went by, she started feeling trapped. Daniel monitored her movements, questioned her friendships, and often dismissed her feelings. Rita prayed and asked for guidance, but she was beginning to see a side of Daniel she had never imagined. At church, Daniel continued to play the role of a loving husband. He led prayers, encouraged other men to be strong leaders, and gave testimonies about their happy marriage. Rita, on the other hand, remained silent. She knew that if she spoke up, people would not believe her. She had convinced everyone, including herself, that she was living a dream. How could she now say otherwise? One day, she confided in an older woman from the church, hoping for guidance. "Marriage is not easy, my dear," the woman said. "You must endure. A wife's patience brings peace to the home." Rita nodded but felt empty. Endurance was not what she had imagined marriage to be. The pressure to keep up appearances was growing, and she felt more alone than ever. Rita began noticing how Daniel's temper would flare over the smallest things. If she disagreed with him, his voice would rise, his words sharp and filled with authority. "You don't respect me," he would say, his eyes cold. The first time he grabbed her wrist tightly during an argument, she was too shocked to react. He let go just as quickly, acting as if nothing had happened. At church, He continued his role as a devoted husband, speaking about love and patience in marriage. Rita sat beside him, her wrist still aching, wondering if anyone could see through the act. She wanted to talk to someone, but who would believe her? She was married to the perfect man. One evening, she asked Daniel if they could visit her parents for the weekend. His expression darkened. "You're my wife now. Your place is here," he said firmly. Rita lowered her gaze, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her world was shrinking, and she had no one to turn to. That night, she sat on the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was not the same hopeful bride from months ago. She was beginning to see the truth about her marriage, and it terrified her. Rita started noticing how much she had changed. She no longer smiled easily, and she felt tense whenever Daniel was around. At church, she continued to play the role of the devoted wife, but inside, she was struggling. She wanted to believe that marriage required endurance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, she overheard Daniel speaking on the phone in hushed tones. His voice was sharp, almost threatening. "I told you to stop calling me," he said before hanging up. When he turned around and saw Rita standing there, his expression darkened. "What are you looking at?" he asked coldly. Rita hesitated but decided to ask, "Who was that?" His jaw tightened. "Don't ever question me again," he said before walking away. Her heart pounded. She knew something was off. That night, when Daniel was asleep, she picked up his phone. Her hands shook as she scrolled through his messages. There were conversations with a woman named Clara. The messages were personal, too personal. Rita's stomach turned. The man who demanded her submission and obedience was hiding secrets of his own. The next morning, she confronted him. "Who is Clara?" she asked, holding up his phone. Daniel's face darkened with anger. "How dare you touch my phone?" he snapped. "A good wife respects her husband's privacy." He grabbed the phone from her hands and walked out of the room without another word. Rita sat on the bed, shaking. She had always believed that her church marriage would protect her from betrayal. But now, she realized that Daniel was not the godly husband she thought he was. The truth was right in front of her, and she could no longer ignore it. Rita tried to convince herself that things would get better. She prayed harder, fasted longer, and read every scripture she could find about patience in marriage. But nothing changed. Daniel remained cold and controlling. His words, once filled with charm, now carried sharp edges that cut her deeply. One afternoon, she gathered the courage to visit her mother. She expected warmth and comfort, but instead, she was met with silence. When she finally opened up about how Daniel treated her, her mother sighed. "Marriage is not easy, my daughter," she said, echoing the words Rita had heard before. "Men can be difficult, but a wise woman keeps her home. You must endure." Rita's heart sank. There would be no rescue. Desperate, she turned to her best friend, Amaka, the only person who might understand. When they met at a quiet restaurant, Rita hesitated before speaking. "I don't know who I married," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Amaka reached for her hand. "Rita, you don't have to suffer. You need to speak up." But who would listen? Who would believe her over Daniel, the perfect church leader? That night, Daniel noticed she had been quiet all evening. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. Rita shook her head. "Nothing." But deep inside, she was drowning in fear and doubt. As she lay in bed, she realized the painful truth. If she wanted to escape this life, she would have to find her own way out. Rita started noticing how much she had changed. She no longer smiled easily, and she felt tense whenever Daniel was around. At church, she continued to play the role of the devoted wife, but inside, she was struggling. She wanted to believe that marriage required endurance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, she overheard Daniel speaking on the phone in hushed tones. His voice was sharp, almost threatening. "I told you to stop calling me," he said before hanging up. When he turned around and saw Rita standing there, his expression darkened. "What are you looking at?" he asked coldly. Rita hesitated but decided to ask, "Who was that?" His jaw tightened. "Don't ever question me again," he said before walking away. Her heart pounded. She knew something was off. That night, when Daniel was asleep, she picked up his phone. Her hands shook as she scrolled through his messages. There were conversations with a woman named Clara. The messages were personal, too personal. Rita's stomach turned. The man who demanded her submission and obedience was hiding secrets of his own. The next morning, she confronted him. "Who is Clara?" she asked, holding up his phone. Daniel's face darkened with anger. "How dare you touch my phone?" he snapped. "A good wife respects her husband's privacy." He grabbed the phone from her hands and walked out of the room without another word. Rita sat on the bed, shaking. She had always believed that her church marriage would protect her from betrayal. But now, she realized that Daniel was not the godly husband she thought he was. The truth was right in front of her, and she could no longer ignore it. Thank you for watching. Kindly like, comment, subscribe, and share for more interesting stories.